a set of problems, issues having to do with the nutrient runoff and the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And the question is, how legally is that going to be handled? So we're talking about the Clean Water Act, and obviously one possible approach is to set nutrient water quality standards and then adopt TMDLs that limit the amount of nutrients in various portions of the Mississippi River Basin. And so that's a fairly strongly regulatory approach. And as we talked about previously, there was a lawsuit, the Gulf Restoration Network lawsuit, that was aimed at forcing the U.S. EPA to set numeric nutrient criteria, meaning quantitative, so actual number limits. The EPA declined to do that, and while initially that was overturned by the courts, they said that the EPA didn't have that didn't offer justifications. Further, in the litigation sort of proceeded further along, the EPA came up with a set of justifications, and the courts deferred to the agency. So they deferred to the EPA, and the EPA's decision was to rely on or focus on more collaborative efforts. So our client, the Kentucky Farm Bureau, as you might imagine, would prefer collaborative efforts to regulatory efforts, right? That's obvious. I think that's pretty obvious. That makes sense. But then the question is, what do those efforts look like? And so we're going to dive into that today on different kinds of collaborative watershed governance institutions and systems, and look at that. But one of the things that you need to think about as you are representing the Kentucky Farm Bureau on this problem, or when you go out in practice and you deal with similar types of clients, is, okay, at the moment, there is not really the political will to adopt these sort of regulations that would impose numeric criteria on nutrients in the Mississippi River Basin, and then adopt TMDLs that require various contributors, both point source and non-point source, sources of nutrients to limit or manage their nutrient runoff. So there's just not the political will for that right now. But think about how you represent your client, and do you need to be suggesting, preparing sort of a blueprint or suggesting some solutions that position your client for when the politics of that changes, right? I mean, so your client might not even envision that happening. It might just say, hey, we need to persist in the political pressure that we put on the federal agencies, on Congress, et cetera, and that may work for a while. But just look over the whole history of the environmental law that we've just addressed in class, okay? And we haven't addressed all of it. But look at the sweep of history, right? And there's been changes over time, right? The political trends of one period of time are not going to be the same as always. And you look at who controls the White House, who controls Congress, the makeup of the courts. It all changes over time. And so if you want to think about how your client is most likely to be able to influence long-term approaches to nutrient management in the Mississippi River Basin, you need to think about what would a set of governance institutions look like that would be consistent with your client's goals or interests, that would advance your client's goals and interests, and that would be perhaps could be more long-lasting than the current sort of, well, we're just not going to regulate, we're going to collaborate. But what kind of collaborative arrangements would be more likely to produce success? Because while Kentucky farmers do not want their nutrient runoff regulated, in the end, if this continues to be a problem, right, eventually political pressure will be brought to bear. I mean, there are too many other economic actors who are affected, right? So if you've got the whole environmental movement, maybe they'll be affected, maybe they won't politically. But if now you have coalitions of environmentalists and fisheries and shipping industries and other economic actors who are saying, hey, our economic livelihood is being adversely affected by these huge algae blooms or public health problems, right? It becomes more like the Cuyahoga River catching fire, and it becomes a big, big event that then triggers action. And so again, you represent your client well. You're sort of thinking ahead and getting out ahead of that. So in thinking about environmental governance institutions, we're turning to a particular scale of environmental governance that is watershed focused. Okay, so that's what we're talking about today. The statutes and regulatory regimes that we've talked about so far are all focused on other kinds of things. They're focused on specific aspects of the environment that we're trying to protect against, specific harms to the environment, specific government agency actions. But now what we're saying is, hey, let's think more ecosystem oriented. Let's think about how nature organizes things, and let's focus on watersheds. What I want to point out here is watersheds can be anywhere on a spectrum from large scale. Okay, so the Mississippi River Basin, the entire basin, is almost as large as you get in any type of watershed institutional watershed collaboration. The Great Lakes is similarly large. The Great Lakes Basin is large. The Chesapeake Basin is large. But so when we talk about Mississippi River, that's large scale. But then one of the things you see is you have a lot of activity at much smaller scale. So you have sub-basins and small watersheds and small catchments. You've got activity happening there, and so that can be pretty small scale. So I mean, a number of you are familiar with efforts around Beargrass Creek, for example. That's a very small scale kind of focal point. That's a small urban watershed entirely in Jefferson County and so forth. And those produce very different kinds of activities and results. And it's a spectrum, so it's anywhere in between. And then what are the scope of the problems that we're dealing with? Are we dealing with specific kinds of problems? Whole bunch of problems? Are we going to be kind of very laser focused, or is this going to be kind of more of a generalist approach? What are the purposes and outcomes intended for these environmental governance institutions, these watershed governance institutions? So some are really pretty much mostly informational and about programmatic coordination. So sharing information, gathering information, coordinating existing programs among various stakeholders. So that is, when we look at the Mississippi River Basin Initiative, most of that is at that level. Also the task force. So you have a meeting that sort of analyzed both of those, the task force and then the Mississippi River Basin Initiative. And what that report shows, it's a little dated, but what it shows is most of the activities involve gathering and sharing information and data and coordinating existing programs among federal agencies and state governments. Okay? But watershed governance institutions can engage in decisions about policies, plans, regulations, so more decision making. Okay? And that could be everything from adopting a plan to actually operating a regulatory program. And so, for example, the Lake Tahoe Regional Planning Agency. I mentioned this before. It came out actually when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, and it is it's a watershed-focused entity, but it's highly regulatory. Others are more just planning-oriented, but less specific regulations, but that kind of idea. Or you can have watershed governance institutions that are very action-oriented. So these might involve things like restoration projects, water management projects, managing stream flows and so forth, wildlife conservation projects and so forth, so very action-oriented as a possibility. And again, this is something of a you have spectrum, you can kind of mix and match, so that's relevant. The next sort of question we have to ask is what's the degree of cooperation? So you see that we're sort of focused to some degree on multi-stakeholder watershed collaboration. And so a lot of these tend to be collaborative, but they don't all have to be. Okay? They don't all have to be. So some of these watershed governance institutions actually have a fair amount of conflict, a fair amount of adversarial interaction. There's litigation. There's regulatory activity where the officials come in and say, you're industry or developer or landowner, whether you're polluting too much, and we're issuing an order against you, and then that gets appealed, or there's a permit to get a variance and so forth, and it becomes less cooperative and more adversarial. What we're going to talk about is oftentimes this really ends up being iterations. It kind of bounces back and forth between being more cooperative and more adversarial. And then another question is who ends up making up the watershed institutions? Is it primarily government-created, government-driven? Is it primarily bottom-up, multi-stakeholder driven? So a multi-stakeholder just means that there's multiple stakeholders. Sometimes this is called citizen-driven, but generally it's some sort of group or set of groups that is creating these and pushing these, or it can be hybrid of government and multiple stakeholders. And then finally, what sort of legal authority exists? And so again, it's a spectrum from very formal in structure to very informal and ad hoc, and the institution can be anywhere on that spectrum. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint. I gave this a number of years ago at Utah's College of Law at the Stegner Center there, and I've added some slides to it, so it's been updated, but this is about how watershed institutions in the U.S. have emerged or evolved. And one of the things that is just sort of interesting point is that when John Wesley Powell, famous scientist, explorer, he went and explored the western part of the United States and wrote a report for Congress. And it was a report on the arid lands of the American West. He made a very famous trip down the Colorado River from Wyoming all the way. He went through the Grand Canyon on the Colorado River at a time when it was mostly only Native Americans who were in any part of this part of the country. And one of the things that he did is, in his report, he proposed that the western part of the United States be organized around watersheds or water basins. He said it's a land that has a lot of aridity, a lack of rain, and that we should organize around hydrographic basins or watersheds. And then Walt Stegner wrote about John Wesley Powell's proposal and so forth. And so, and part of my point here, of course, because I was speaking at the Stegner Center, I was trying to kind of build off of Stegner's Beyond the 100th Meridian book about Powell, was to sort of say that throughout the United States, so there's a time when a lot of interest in watershed institutions arose in the western part of the United States simply because they had so little water. They still have so little water. They have so little water, and there's all sorts of land development happening in economic growth. But increasingly, that is true all over the United States. So we've already talked about the Everglades, we've talked about the Mississippi River, we've talked about Fairgrass Creek. All throughout the United States, we have become increasingly interested in organizing governance in some way, not replacing the existing governance, but trying to organize some kind of governance activities around watersheds. When we think about watersheds, we're talking about areas of land that drain to a common body of water, so it's the intersection of land and water. And Stegner wrote particularly about how the West had a sort of geography of hope. And what he said, his perspective on that was that it was often a geography of hope built on resource exploitation and transformation of watersheds for human development, human economic activity, and so forth. We're going to make it rich by doing a lot of mining and doing a lot of massive cattle raising and that kind of stuff. But as you know from our study of Mono Lake, and there's David Gaines again floating in Mono Lake, is that, interestingly enough, watersheds have become this sort of a different kind of geography of hope where there's sort of this place-based interest in conservation and transformation of the communities that are organized around these watersheds. So we have these watersheds institutions that have emerged. So talking about watersheds, areas of land that drain to a common body of water. And so this shows kind of the nested scale of watersheds where you have a small catchment within a sub-watershed, within a watershed, which is within a river basin or sub-basin. Institutions, institutions are not organizations per se. Okay, people throw this around, they refer to this institution, that institution. In social science and political science, the word institution means a set of rules or values or norms that shape behavior. That we act because we believe in the institution. We act because the institutions are considered legitimate, so they can be very formal. So legal institutions, we talk about legal institutions, sets of laws, systems of laws. Okay, so we accept those. They can be more policy or governance institutions, policy choices, and so forth. The way government ends up being structured. But they can also be informal norms, okay? So the classic example of an institution operating in law school without any formal process whatsoever is once you take a seat, first day of class, that's your seat, right? Okay? And if anybody sits in it, they get the evil eye, and they you say something right, and everybody sort of respects. That's your seat. Well, where's the rule that says that? Right? There's no rule, right? We don't have any. The assistant dean of students didn't kick you out of school for sitting in somebody else's seat, right? I mean, we don't have any rule. But it's just a set of norms. Standing in line is another one, right? You queue up in order, and if somebody cuts, then people start getting grumpy and so forth. It can even get you can get sort of escalation of conflict or whatever. But we all just sort of accept it, right? That sort of first come first serve. You don't cut in line in the grocery store or that kind of thing. So those are institutions of sorts. And then when I talk about emergence, what I'm talking about is that over time, we've seen these institutions appear and have some actual effect in the world without any seeming top-down organized design. They come from a lot of different places, and yet there are some commonalities. So this is just a cool, pretty picture of how watersheds work, and you can see that the water's all going to drain from the divides, which are generally ridges of sorts, on down to a common some sort of common body of water. Here's some other pictures that depict this, so that that's what just sort of shows how smaller catchments are in larger catchments. This is a picture of watersheds within Jefferson County. You can pay more attention to all of that in the PowerPoint later. This is the Mississippi River Basin with its various major subbasins. So we have the Ohio River, the Upper Mississippi River, the Missouri, the Arkansas, which of course we in Kansas call the Arkansas, red-white basin, and then the lower Mississippi is where it all comes together. And then of course there's the picture of the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So watershed institutions have arisen because there have been a lot of inadequacies in existing governance systems. So we have a lot of new and unresolved problems that don't get resolved by the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, NEPA, and so forth very well. As we talked about before, issues and systems are interdependent, and we care about how multiple systems are resilient. We want our economies to be resilient. We want our wildlife habitats to be resilient. We want our drinking water systems to be resilient. We want our rivers and streams to be resilient. And so when we start thinking about all that together, we've got to sort of think beyond our traditional legal regimes. And so we start thinking about ecosystem scales, multiple scales, and place-based conservation. And I'm going to skip through that because we've already talked about fourth generation environmental law. And basically, a lot of watershed governance systems started out of the third generation, which focused on things like ecosystems and collaborative processes and adaptive management. And then they really picked up in this fourth generation environmental law when we were focused on system resilience. So that's just a picture of that. And this is a diagram that shows that all this kind of change towards more flexible approaches have been going on at the same time in environmental law, land use law, and water law. Okay? And that's relevant because even though this class is all about environmental law, the watershed governance is where all three areas of law come together. Okay? So we're dealing with water rights, we're dealing with land use planning and regulation, which is going to be offered next semester, and we're dealing with environmental law, and a lot of that's being handled through these watershed institutions altogether. Okay, so how do we know that watershed institutions have become so dominant? Well, all the way, this is 7 years ago, we had 411 state statutes with watershed in the title of the statute, over 5,500 state statutory sections with watershed in the text of the statute. The EPA has an entire set of policies and programs organized around watersheds, so does the Forest Service, and if you just start counting up all of the groups, organizations, networks, committees, task force that have some kind of watershed focus, right? It's enormous, right? So we've got the Kentucky Waterways Alliance, we've got the Beargrass Creek Alliance, we've got the Friends of Floyd's Fork, we've got the Floyd's Fork Environmental Association, and so on and so forth, right? With watershed focus. Well, one of the issues is when we say, hey, we've got all these new watershed institutions, this is all new, shiny, cool, whatever, but do they actually do anything? Do they actually make any difference? And the answer is yes and no. Okay, it's a mixed picture. My assessment is these watershed institutions are doing some things for us that traditional legal institutions have not been doing for us. Okay, so we're getting some improvements in some ways. Some of them are more effective than others, but there is some research out there that is very critical of collaborative ecosystem management generally, and says that for the most part, what you get is a lot of vague, feel-good goals. So everybody gets together, they adopt a bunch of things like, hey, we want the Mississippi River to be clean and beautiful, and make our country great, and so on and so forth. They get together and they talk about that and agree. And maybe they agree to share some information, share some money, maybe even resources, but the actual outcomes are never mandatory, they're never achieved, and so forth. So Judith Laser has a book. She's a political scientist at MIT, and she has a book called Natural Experiments, and she says that these things actually don't work. What her view is that they work, that the law and policy making by government works better. That's her view. Having said that, most of the case studies that she has that show ineffectual results are ones that were also ineffectual when the laws and the traditional government institutions were controlling the outcomes as well. Okay, so in other words, maybe the problems in those watersheds are so massive that there's never going to be an effective solution. The problem also with some of this research is they treat these watershed institutions monolithically, and the reality is watershed institutions are very diverse, as I pointed out here. And also, if you look at the outcome of a particular watershed institution or particular collaborative process at one point in time, that's not going to tell you very much. That's a snapshot, because these things are constantly emerging and evolving. Okay, they're very dynamic. So, for example, there is a very complex set of problems in managing and governing the Bay Delta system in California. So this is this massive system that includes the San Francisco Bay and the Delta system all the way over to like Sacramento and that area. And you've got a lot of water transfers going back and forth. You've got lots of rivers involved. You've got aquatic species. You've got various users. It's very complex. And there was a process called CalFed, which means state of California, the federal government, the leaders, but it was multi-stakeholder. They organized and they had this whole governance system. And there was a time when almost all researchers said, oh, CalFed is the new way to go. This is collaborative. It gets beyond sort of all the fragmentation of legal authority. Hey, isn't this great? CalFed is going to achieve these major improvements in water management in Northern California. Then you had the series of research that said CalFed is failing, and then you had the research which was actually technically true on its face. It says CalFed is dead. Okay, so CalFed ended up being so massive, so many stakeholders, so cumbersome. The process was so cumbersome that it actually really did die and it fell apart. And yet, It didn't, because all of those networks, all of those relationships among the stakeholders still existed. The way of thinking about it as a big, massive ecosystem problem still existed. And all of a sudden, I don't know, maybe about 4 years, I might not have the time exactly right, but a few years after CalFed died, the California legislature created the Bay Delta Council. And so a brand new system emerged that had a better structure. Okay? Now, I'm not going to tell you that it's going to fix all the problems, because there's still a lot of complex problems, but basically they redesigned the system to be a little bit more adaptive and not so cumbersome. So basically, it's not over till it's over, and even then it's not over. Okay? So the bottom line is not over till it's over, even then it's not over. So just some pictures about the many different kinds of watershed institutions that deal with everything from flood to drought. So Everglades, Darby Creek is in Oldham County. A group of students a number of years ago who worked on contributing to their watershed plan. We talked a little bit about Darby Creek, and then we had the Harris Creek kayaking in the field study. Colorado River Compact, huge. The Colorado River is big, and so this is very legal. There's a compact that was approved by all the states in the Colorado Basin, so they're listed there, and approved by Congress. Interstate compacts have to be approved by Congress because, why? What's this? No, not Commerce Clause. The Constitution. Okay, there's a constitutional provision that prohibits states from entering into agreements with each other without Congress' approval, because they didn't want the states to gang up on the federal government, right? So the Interstate Compact Clause is a part of the Constitution, and so like for example, the Great Lakes Basin Compact had to be approved by Congress, and so this was approved, and all of the rules for how the Colorado River is managed and how that water gets allocated is called the law of the river. Okay, so people, lawyers who deal with this. Okay, there are a bunch of lawyers who make a bunch of money in the western part of the United States, and some of them, maybe they don't make a bunch of money, but this, they work for the government or nonprofit organization, environmental groups, but they spend a lot of time on this, and they have their careers are based on it, and they talk in hushed tones about the law of the river very reverently and so forth, because it is a thing. It's taken on a life of its own. And here's an example of a group, Floyd's Fork Environmental Association, organized around a watershed. That's like a citizen group. Here is the Forest Service engaged in watershed planning in the National Forest. And then we're going to talk about the Clark Fork River Basin Task Force in Montana. That was a multi-stakeholder organization that did a lot to engage in the restoration of Clark Fork. At one time, this was the largest Superfund site in the United States. Why? It's because there was a dam, and there was a lot of mining waste that was in the river and in the river bed, in the soils in the river, behind the dam from all this mining. I think it was gold, maybe uranium, I don't know. It's bad stuff, lots of bad stuff. And in order to improve the flows and functions of the Clark Fork and to get water to all the different users, okay, Montana's a little bit water scarce, and a lot of people using the water from the Clark Fork, there was an agreement to remove the dam. Okay, what's going to happen when you remove the dam? All those toxins in the water are going to flow downstream, right? And so now, when you have this massive area behind the dam polluted, now you have the whole river polluted, right? So they had to figure out a plan for doing this, okay? Lots of stakeholders. It took a lot of time, a lot of hassle. Yeah, it's sort of nominally named a collaborative solution, but there was litigation. There was a lot of yelling and cussing at each other, okay? But eventually, they reached an agreement. Okay, so this is just a different way of reflecting what we've already talked about. There's lots of different dimensions of diversity in watershed institutions. There's some bigger issues here related to some things that we study about institutions, polycentric approaches, innovation networks, etc. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that. Complexity, place-based conservation, and then also just the idea that there may be some evolutionary forces at work here. We talked previously about how systems change over time in the anarchy model, and this might be, those are pretty pictures. This is actually maybe more likely how it looks in real life, all over the map. Okay, so how these watersheds change over time. Both conflict and cooperation are persistent, but they are also iterative. And so if you watch, you will see this back and forth when the parties get together. They maybe reach some agreements, then they disagree about some things, then they're unhappy, they're suing each other, right? There's pushback, there's political protest, et cetera, right? And then eventually, that's not a good place to remain over time, right? That's actually not achieving anything. And some people kind of like that, some people like the conflict, but in general, that ends up not being very effective. So again, there becomes pressure to try to find common ground, to find some point of cooperation, just back and forth, that iteration. Adaptation, we talk a lot about adaptation, but adaptation is a major part of why watershed governance institutions emerge, okay? Right? We're going to need to deal with these watershed problems in an adaptive way, and the legal system that we have, like for example, the Clean Water Act, is not especially adaptive. NEPA, we talked about that, not especially adaptive. Endangered Species Act. And so we get innovation, we get learning by doing, learning from feedback loops. But while these institutions emerge and they evolve, they can also ossify. Okay? They can also get institutionalized. I wouldn't worry too much about that. This is some social science and language, but this is actually shows what can happen. So you can get on a scale, you can get in the middle incremental change. You can have more revolutionary or dramatic change. You have system collapse. On the other end of the spectrum, you can have resistance to change, and then you can have what's called ossification, where it becomes very embedded. It becomes very resistant. Not only resistant to change, but it becomes sort of a whole thing in and of itself. And there is some mix of choices about institutional design, and then larger forces, political forces, economic forces, legal forces that are at work. Okay, so I mentioned Clark Fork earlier. Also in Montana is the Blackfoot Challenge. Blackfoot Challenge is kind of a cool case study because the Blackfoot Valley is a ranching area, and for the most part, the ranchers who live in the area need water. They had a fair amount of hostility towards the Indian tribes in the area, unlike Clark Fork, where the Indian tribes were a major cooperator, a major part of the solution. But Blackfoot Challenge is a little bit of tension there, and there's a lot of negative views among the ranchers towards federal agencies, federal government. However, they became concerned about various issues surrounding the watershed and its governance, and therefore when the U.S. Forest Service and Trout Unlimited, okay, so a conservation group focused more on kind of the fishing community, and the U.S. Forest Service, a federal agency, but not not as regulatory, came together and proposed creating this multi-stakeholder collaboration called the Blackfoot Challenge. They agreed, and they started having meetings. And again, it went all harmony and love, right? And there's sort of a took a while to build trust. And they started with small things. They started with things like there's some cattle grazing issues. They started with things like how to reduce grizzly bear attacks on livestock and humans, and it wasn't so much the humans, but homes and cars and stuff like that. So basically, they tried to come up with some solutions. They had part of the livestock grazing problem had to do with some invasive species of weeds and grasses and so forth that were bad for the cattle, bad for the ecosystem, and how are you going to work together to eliminate that? And so piece by piece, they finally started moving towards a plan for how they're going to manage water and water scarcity in this drought-prone region, and do it in a way that pushed back against land development. They said, hey, there's something about the Blackfoot Valley that's a way of life, okay? That's a way of life. And so they kind of brought together the ecosystem-oriented goals and we want to preserve our ranching way of life goals, and hey, we don't want a bunch of Californians moving into our area and building their ranchettes or whatever, right? This was the gist of what, so some common ground, and eventually they developed a plan whereby water users would cut back proportionally during times of drought. Okay, to get an agreement like that in the West is remarkable because the western part of the United States follows a prior appropriation system, first in time, first in right. If you have old rights, you are not legally required to cut back in times of drought. You're just not, right? Okay, and so to voluntarily agree to that was a big step, right? And so actually, people say, hey, these watershed collaborations, they don't actually achieve anything. The quality of the stream flow, the health of the trout in the Blackfoot, way better than it used to be. Okay, so we've seen big improvements. We've seen the invasives managed and controlled. We've seen the big reductions in the grizzly bear attacks, so on and so forth. Okay? Floyd's Fork watershed is a different kind of example. You're having a lot of activity organized around Floyd's Fork, but by and large, the multi-stakeholder collaboration out there fell apart when the Floyd's Fork Environmental Association, pictured here, and then with the mayor, sued all of the other stakeholders, saying that the meetings were subject to open meetings and open records. Eventually, Kentucky Supreme Court says no. Actually, all the courts from trial level all the way up said no, it's not. But in the meanwhile, of course, the whole thing's had dissolved. Who wants to be a part of something where you're going to get sued for being a part of it, right? Trust was broken, and the Floyd's Fork Environmental Association became kind of more and more extreme in their sort of more activist or antagonistic approach. But as a number of you know from the field study class, part of what happened out there in terms of conservation was the development of the Parklands of Floyd's Fork by a nonprofit organization, 21st Century Parks, that has lots of partners, both governmental, all levels of government, and non-governmental, okay? Public engagement, et cetera, but it is it's a park. It's a recreational use, human use, but it's got a watershed focus about protecting and maintaining the health and function of Floyd's Fork. So lo and behold, there are some of you in these pictures out at Floyd's Fork, okay? So, and so what we see is, yes, land development happening and so forth, but we also see a watershed conservation focus to it, but not the kind of multi-stakeholder effort that you see in some other areas. The state of Washington has a different kind of model. State law. So the state legislature mandates planning at the watershed scale. So it divides the state up into these water resource inventory areas, WRIAs, under the State Watershed Planning Act, right here. There's what I mentioned, and it has required multi-stakeholder collaborative planning for the water resources and also species, aquatic species, around the watershed level. So there's a whole bunch of plans that have been approved. This is also an example of if you create a system, it may actually go beyond what the law requires. So the law required the creation, the creation of these planning units and the development of a planning process and the adoption of a plan, and then that's pretty much it. You didn't actually have to implement the plan, you didn't have to do anything about it, you didn't have to keep going. The majority of these units ended up asking the state agencies, the State Department of Ecology, to continue their existence, in other words, to keep going as a multi-stakeholder planning entity to monitor the plan, to implement the plan, and to update and revise the plan periodically. And also the majority of the watershed areas adopted plan elements that were optional, that were voluntary. So they not only adopted the mandatory elements, but they also adopted optional or voluntary elements, which says, a lot of sort of research or theory about law and how it works would say, well, if something's not mandated, people aren't going to do it, right? It happens. And so that's kind of interesting. And I think my view is, as these stakeholders had a process and a system for working together, they took advantage of it. They said, hey, we have shared problems here. We have issues to deal with. Let's use the system to deal with it. Okay, so you had reading on the Chesapeake Bay. Okay? So Chesapeake Bay is a drainage basin, has a drainage basin that's massive, has lots of problems, but primarily nutrient runoff. There's a lot of agricultural activity, but there's also a lot of land development and so forth. And so you see these like algae blooms and that kind of stuff, and it's causing a lot of harm and problems in the Chesapeake Bay. So you have the reading on that, and the general gist is Colburn, the author of the reading on the Chesapeake Bay collaboration, is very praises it a lot, is very positive about it. I mentioned earlier Judith Laser in her book Natural Experiments is very critical of it. Okay, so. Well, it's one of these things where you can look at it glass half empty or glass half full, right? I mean, you can look at it either way. There are a couple of key components of this. One is that, as the reading pointed out, the fact that numeric water quality standards for nutrients in the Chesapeake Bay had to be set and TMDLs had to be adopted was part of what forced collaboration. So coercing collaboration is the title of the article. It really forced or triggered the collaboration that resulted, because people were like, well, instead of, there's going to be regulation, so instead of having everything determined from a top-down, very strict regulatory approach, maybe we could achieve these pollution goals, these pollution reduction goals, by working together and figuring out a way to do it. The other thing I think is key to this is that part of the collaborative process involved a whole lot of very detailed information gathering and information sharing. Okay? And the only way that you're really going to know what you need to do and where you need to do it and how effective it's going to be if you do it, or you try to do it, is if you gather that kind of information. And again, you're talking about such a massive scale that you really needed this collaborative effort to get there. Having said that, there has been sort of criticism on both sides, not only by the scholars, but by various groups and interests and so forth. Environmentalists feel like it's too collaborative and not enough demanded, not enough performance standards put into place. And the farmers and industry groups and Chamber of Commerce and so on and so forth have been critical that too much is demanded, that it's too regulatory driven and therefore too costly. But there's a picture of the entire Chesapeake Bay Basin, and then there is the agreement that was put out in 2000. Okay, it's a draft for public review and comment for this particular agreement. Anybody have any thoughts about what might drive the public review and comment?
The fishing industry in some ways.
Maybe.
I'm just conceptually, yes.
Yeah. Okay. From this class, what's going to drive? You have something that you're putting together, a partnership, an agreement, and you have to put it out for public review and comment. What's going to drive that? Okay, is this a rule? No. Okay, so it is not notice and comment rulemaking. What law is going to drive this? Think back, what we studied all through the semester. Okay, let me think. Was it the Endangered Species Act? No, that's not it. Okay. What? No, so APA could be it, but it's not, because it's not a rulemaking. Not rulemaking. What is it? Possible that it's a major federal action that might have a significant impact on the environment, which is going to be governed by NEPA. NEPA. Okay, this includes EIS analysis, environmental impacts. Okay, so it's an agreement you put out, but in it is embedded an environmental impact statement. Okay, it's a major federal action that could have a significant impact on the environment. Yes? Very good. Right. Nice review. Mississippi River Basin. Okay, so now what do we do about the Mississippi River Basin? So this is another picture of the basin, right? So you've got the Arkansas, the red, the lower Mississippi, the Tennessee, Ohio, upper Mississippi, and Missouri. Okay, a lot of area, right? That's quite a substantial portion of the United States. Right? So what do you think is the success rate of a small scale watershed collaboration versus a large scale watershed collaboration? Which do you think is more successful? Small, yes, exactly, right? By far, the small scale ones. Okay, Blackfoot Challenge, one of the very successful ones, small scale. Okay, CalFed, much more difficult. I mean, we haven't really seen if that's going to produce any positive results. Massive. Okay, Chesapeake Bay, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but again, it's massive. And part of what's causing the critique of it is it's massive. It's just such a big scale. So this is obviously a challenge. How do you really get a handle on a problem that is occurring at a basin-wide scale? But just think about all the stakeholders that are involved. Okay, all the federal agencies, right? Right, all the federal agencies. That's a lot of federal agencies just by itself. Then all of the states. How many states that is, right? That's a lot of states. All the local governments. Now you're sort of exponentially increasing. Right? All of the various resource users, or industry groups, or businesses, or service providers, and so on and so forth. Okay, so just think even about agriculture, right? Your client is the Kentucky Farm Bureau. Okay, that's a whole bunch of different kinds of farmers. We talked about that, right? And then there's a whole bunch of different kinds of, and then beyond that, that's just Kentucky. We'll talk about how there's sort of differences between the sort of agricultural community makeup in Kentucky versus maybe someplace like Illinois or Iowa. Right, lots of different kinds of, think about all the different kinds of environmental groups, community-based groups that may be involved, and so on and so forth. Right, and so I mean. You all saw right about the Ironman swimming being canceled due to algae blooms in the Ohio, right? Okay, so now all of a sudden, you've got groups that are interested in being stakeholders that maybe before had no interest in the Gulf hypoxic zone. But now, all of a sudden, we have algae blooms in the Ohio River that are affecting Ironman, and now they want to be involved. So just you think about the massive number of stakeholders in the very broad and complex scale of the problem. So that's a challenge. When we talk about collaboration at the Mississippi River Basin scale, we have really at least 3 different things that are happening. Okay? So one has to do with a set of cooperation among federal agencies. Right? So you have federal agencies that are working together. Then you have the Mississippi River Basin Initiative, MRBI, which is largely led by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but also has a whole bunch of federal agencies, but then all of the states that are in the Mississippi River Basin. It is primarily, and there's actually, I think, there's a couple of Indian tribes that are also part of it, but it is primarily a governmental collaboration, but at multiple jurisdictional scales, so federal and state. And they're aiming to engage primarily the agricultural community in working on this, but through their existing programs. So it's really more about information sharing, resource sharing, and programmatic collaboration. Okay? And so one of the things you should take from the reading that was critical of it is sort of like, well, is there really much happening? I mean, are there any actual performance measures? Are there any outcomes? There's really no regulation, right? It's largely driven by that. Third type of collaboration is that there are a couple of different kinds of collaborations between major environmental groups, major companies that are committed somehow to addressing this, and then some federal agencies. And there may be some state agencies involved as well. But these are things like, the Nature Conservancy. There may be timber industry that's sort of concerned about water quality, and the timber barge traffic people, and so on and so forth. And so this is more about restoration and conservation efforts, like that Sturgis property I told you about that the Nature Conservancy has over in far western Kentucky that is meant to be wetland conservation to filter out nutrient pollutants. And so you get those kinds of collaborations as well. Okay, all of that is very cooperative, and it's unclear what kind of real outcomes are happening. All of them, though, as the report points out, all of them are trying to break down their actions or their decision making or their sharing of information and so forth on sub-watershed levels. In other words, try to break it down and sort of say, oh, this is what we're doing over here in Arkansas, or some portion of Arkansas, or this is like, so for example, one focal point is the Green River Basin, right? So we've got the upper and lower portion of the Green River. You know Green River in Kentucky, yes? Yes, flows through most of southern and western Kentucky through the Mammoth Cave, huge, massive thing. We've got a lot of dam removal happening on the Green River, which has been actually gotten a lot of national attention because it's leading to improved water flows, improved aquatic conditions, habitat conditions for aquatic species. So the mussels are doing better because of this. But it's it's a focal point because it's a large river basin that empties into the Ohio right before the Ohio empties into the Mississippi. So what does this mean? So one of the things that we need to think about when we think about these watershed institutions is what builds their capacity and resilience. Okay, are these kind of quick, they last for 10 years and they die out because they didn't achieve anything, or they fell apart because of conflict, or the problems became too big, or they didn't have enough money, or can we build the capacity of these institutions and their resilience? Another issue, we've talked from time to time about this, is that watershed institutions give us an opportunity to reframe problems, to think about the problems in new ways that might have broader buy-in. So instead of thinking about water quality issues as just, for example, industry spewing a bunch of toxic stuff from pipes into our waterways, we can maybe think more broadly. Instead of thinking about just discharges, we might think about watershed function, the health of watersheds, health of the rivers, and so forth. We might think about them as being more connected. So thinking, for example, about what happens in Kentucky affects what happens in the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, there's a time in which very few people thought about that at all. So now we think more about that. So it allows us to reframe. And one of the things that your client is wanting to do is to push back on the framing of the nutrient issue in the Mississippi River Basin as primarily an agricultural-driven runoff problem. Right? Okay, so you want to sort of think more broadly about that if you're working in this area. Feedback loops are a big part of what makes institutions adaptive. And so one of the problems with a lot of these watershed institutions is they do not have continuous monitoring. They're not continually assessing data. They're not learning from scientifically and socially from what's working and what's not working, and then they're not adapting their actions, their policies, their programs, or whatever, laws, etc. Accordingly. And we talked about environmental law is very linear. We adopt something and then we implement it, or we don't, and we don't often kind of continually come back and change or learn from what works and what doesn't and adapt accordingly. When you're assessing these things, you need to think about, you need to have some patience. You need to assess over time. So as I talked about this, the conflict at one point in time, maybe 5 years from now, cooperation. Cooperation right now, maybe 5 years from now, all have fallen apart and we may be in some sort of massive knockdown, drag-out litigation. Right? It happens. Also, structures or processes that seem to be dead or to have failed may come back to life. Right? They may turn into new things, transformation, and they may have surprise successes. The main thing I think that's key here is, we sort of talked about watershed collaboration, and there's a lot of ways in which people sort of say, okay, all this is about some sort of feel-good cooperation or collaboration. We're all going to get together. We're never going to make any hard choices. We're never going to demand anything. We're never going to have any performance measures or performance outcomes. And we're going to feel good, and maybe we'll put a little bit of money into some restoration activities, and it's not really going to do anything. Okay, so that's the focus on the collaborative part. What I want to suggest to you, though, is that maybe with some of these watershed institutions, what we're about to do is focus on the watershed part. Okay, this is a big step forward for us in a lot of ways, to say, hey, we're going to look at these problems in a more systemic approach as to how they actually exist in the real world. Okay? They do not exist in the real world in a set of discrete discharges. They do not exist in the world in a set of this species over here is going extinct, this species over here is recovered. Right? They don't exist in the world in a set of major federal action. Oh, it's a major federal action. Maybe it'll have a significant impact on the environment. Let's do something. Let's do an assessment. Yes, check. Oh, this one's not major, or this one is not going to have this is going to have a moderate effect on the environment, not a significant effect. Okay, right? That's all very artificial. Right? And so what I'm trying to get across here is an example of how environmental law can be very artificial, very legalistic, and these watershed institutions are saying, hey, we've got people, society, water, land, the elements of the ecosystem, and we ought to think about it that way. We ought to think about the Mississippi River as an entire basin that has all of these complexities and problems. And so the point here is maybe that the governance, the political science, sociology, and the law should follow the ecology and hydrology. Okay? So that's sort of a thought about this. Okay. So last point here is we're still going to be learning about these things for years and decades to come, right? So we're going to learn, we're going to continue to monitor, assess, and see what happens. We're going to continue to kind of evolve over time. One of the things, though, that you should think about, and if you were thinking about representing the Kentucky Farm Bureau over the Mississippi River Basin, is whether the systems that are there right now, the collaborations that are existing, are enough. Are they going to work for you? I mean, in some ways, you kind of like them because they're not really expecting too much of them, right? And then the federal agencies and the state agencies are working together to provide some information, some restoration projects. You kind of like that, right? Okay, but the question is, in the long run, is that going to be a very viable institutional design? And if your client is not involved in redesigning the institutions now, are they going to be reacting to somebody else redesigning them 5 or 8 or 10 or 12 years down the road? Right? Does everybody see that issue? So you want to think about that. Now, don't get carried away. Also think about your role as a lawyer. What you do not want to do is to come up with some master solution that you design for the Kentucky Farm Bureau for free, and then have somebody else take over the legal work of actually implementing it, right? Does anybody follow that just in terms of a practice, for law practice management, right? You don't want to, if you're going to represent the Kentucky Farm Bureau, you want them to keep coming back to you for the legal representation, right? That works all the way around. I mean, the agency, okay? You want these random various government officials in your government agency or agencies that you work with to keep coming to you for legal advice, not going out and doing their road thing, and then you have, right? Okay, and then if you represent the public interest sector, right? You don't want somebody else to take over your plan that you developed, and you have done all that work, and then you miss out on being a part of it being actually implemented. So what you want to do is you want to think about how you can recommend to your client that they work on a kind of long-term strategy with you over time, right? Does that make sense from a practice standpoint? That's what you want to think about. Because again, the point of this is these institutions are going to continue to emerge and evolve over time. Okay, it's not a static fix. Where it's not just, hey, I filed a pleading today. The case will go away tomorrow. Okay, this is much bigger than that. Questions? All right. How did we go from like a really? Did we turn the heat on? We went from a like really cold building to like it's really hot in here, right? How did that happen?
I think first floor's still not really cold.
First floor's really cold. It's just down here. Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so I will see everybody.
Because I didn't realize it's like how bad it was, right?
No, it was fine. I mean, like, you're not right.